I've been talking about the Vedic wisdom tradition, and now I'd like to explain just a little about the tradition itself, and also about the essence of the Vedic wisdom. Vedic wisdom tradition appeared in ancient India before the beginnings of history. It's timeless, effectively. The language of the Vedic wisdom tradition, the Vedas, the Vedic literature, the language is called Sanskrit. Sanskrit means perfectly formed, and the Sanskrit alphabet is extraordinarily scientific, and the Sanskrit language, very, very complex, very subtle, very poetic. It's the origin of all the Indo-European languages, which means most of the languages, for example, in India, most of the languages in Europe, including, of course, English, Spanish, Latin, Italian, French, and so on. The social structure, the Vedic social structure, also appears to be the root of the different kinds of social structures that we see in the world today. And there's very good evidence that it was the original culture, the Vedic culture was the original culture, for example, in pre-Christian and pre-Roman Europe and Russia. So, for example, in UK, which is where I come from, the culture before the Romans came was purely Vedic. And the Druids, modern societies, they were actually Vedic sannyasis. Scientific, technological society. And the assumptions in society, more or less, they depend on materialistic philosophy. And I'd just like to talk a little about materialistic philosophy and where it's coming from. So the basic premise is that only matter exists and only physical laws are acting. There's nothing existing except matter. Physical matter means stuff that in principle we can see with the senses, maybe through microscopes and telescopes, but anyway, we see by sense perception, we can analyze by the mind. And only the physical laws are acting. There's no such thing as a real non-physical entity. This is what materialists say. And there's no influence other than just the physical laws. So that means that there's no such thing as a non-physical life force or spirit. It means that life is just a complex electrochemical phenomenon. So Nobel laureate, for example, Nobel laureate Francis Crick, he's written, your joys and sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. And in addition to denying the individual spirit or individual consciousness, materialists also deny the existence of any universal spirit. They deny the fact that, or they deny the idea that, the world is based on consciousness. Now in London, for example, in other cities, there's buses going around with huge placards on. God almost certainly doesn't exist, so better get on with your life and enjoy it. In other words, the philosophy which is being propagated is eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. So Professor Richard Dawkins, probably the world's most prominent and vocal atheist, he says, the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. And Jacques Monod, he's talking about the whole basis of the universe, and his also Nobel laureate. He writes, pure chance, absolutely free but blind, is at the very root of the stupendous edifice of evolution, with the result that man at last knows that he is alone in the unfeeling immensity of the universe. Neither his destiny nor his duty have been written down. It means really there's no meaning to life, and there's no guidelines how we, quote-unquote, should live. So the best thing is we try and live so that we can get the maximum happiness and don't disturb other people to the extent that they start disturbing us. So it's a kind of humanism. It's a convenient way of living. Modern scientists, many of them are atheistic, but the first scientists were not atheists. So, for example, René Descartes and Sir Isaac Newton, these are two very prominent fathers of the whole scientific method. They were very deeply religious. René Descartes wanted to set up a system of certain knowledge based on the existence of the individual consciousness and God. And Isaac Newton said that, okay, we can see that the planets and so on, they're working according to the laws of nature, but they can't have been set up by those laws of nature. We can only assume that there's a grand power, universal power, that's done this. Then other famous scientists like Michael Faraday, Max Born, Louis Pasteur, and modern scientists like the leading geneticist Anderson, and Nobel laureates like Alan Diarmid, who pioneered research on conductive polymers, and William Phillips, who used lasers to cool atoms, and the neurophysiologist Sir John Eccles. They've all emphasized that there's no conflict between a religious worldview and a scientific worldview. In fact, some scientists have said that religion begins with God and real science ends with God. Because at the end of the day, they're saying that we see the hand of God in everything. How do we come to this stage where society is based on the assumption that there's nothing outside of matter and there's no real knowledge outside of scientific knowledge? Well, the early scientists, they saw confusion because people were relying on subjective impressions, rumor, ideas, myths, and so on. So they said, okay, we are going to clarify everything, we'll just rely on observations. I can make observations, you can make observations, we can get the same observations, we can come to the same conclusions. This is the objective method. And it was very successful. After a time, they found that they could make tremendous advances in understanding the properties of matter. So more and more they began to lose interest in subjective knowledge and concentrate on objective knowledge. And then a bit further down the line, they concluded that actually objective knowledge is the only real knowledge. Everything else it's sentimentality, it's not real. And then further down the line again, they said, hey, anything that can't be covered by objective knowledge, it doesn't exist. Objective knowledge is absolutely necessary and sufficient. Anything outside the objective scientific worldview just doesn't exist. It's fantasy. And in this way we come to what has been called scientism. Physical science is successful within the realm of physical objects. But it can't say that there's no other realm. There's nothing in science that says there's nothing outside science. This is just an assumption, it's blind faith. So scientism has been defined as excessive belief in the power of scientific knowledge and techniques. And this is it's the basis of modern education, and it's the basis of the assumptions that run the media and so on. And it's been formally instated in the scientific establishment and in education. For example, the National Academy of Science, they say, because science is limited to explaining the natural world by means of natural processes, it cannot